Mr. Chairman, thank you for those kind words, and in return, may I express my appreciation and the honor I feel in being asked to give this living legend presentation. And after hearing Pierre Clavier and all he's done in his world professional life, I feel even more humbled. And thank you, Pierre, for much friendship over the years. But it hardly seems possible to me now that it's 50 years since Roy Kahn in 1968 first approached me at the spring meeting of the Liver Club in London. And we decided then to link our respective units' strengths in medical and surgical hepatology in a liver transplant program for the UK. At that time, in 1968, I was very busy setting up the medical liver unit at King's from scratch, having just been appointed there some 2 years previously. So it was a big challenge. And before that, I'd had a 5-year stretch with Sheila Sherlock at the Royal Free Hospital, when, in fact, I'd had some limited contact with Roy because he was a surgical registrar there before he accepted the chair of surgery at the University of Cambridge. During that summer of 1968, Roy did 3 transplants at Cambridge, but the longest survival was only 7 weeks. But the first case that we did at King's in the combined program, as I show you in this, I will show you in this in the next slide, was very successful. Carried out on September the 23rd, I remember it well, 1968, LL04, orthopedic liver 4, and there's the picture of Roy at the time. And here's the picture of the patient. He had a massive hepatocellular carcinoma in a non-cirrhotic liver, 19 centimeter diameter. Can you imagine that getting through MDMs and so on today? And he did phenomenally well. He was out of hospital on the 17th day. We couldn't believe it. He went back to his work in a gentleman's outfitters, where's the manager, and I've still got some of the ties he gave me. And he was okay to the 4th, 5th month when he developed a relentless, progressive, cholestatic jaundice, the like of which we had never seen before, and which Bernard Portman, the Swiss histopathologist that I'd recruited to King's, later described as the vanishing bile duct syndrome of chronic rejection. And there on that slide you can see the foamy arteriopathy that is characteristic of chronic rejection. To put into context our program with that of Tom Starzl, who of course led with the very first clinical liver transplants, but that was just about a year before we started. He was working at Denver and he was beginning to get some clinical success, which he largely based on the use of anti-lymphocyte globulin in addition to prednisone and azathioprine as the standard immunosuppressive regime. But it was hard going in those early days, and I've just listed a few in this slide to tell you about it. Selection criteria, well, we didn't have any. The only criteria was that the patient was at death's door and everything else had been tried. There was no brain death criteria. The transplant team had to travel to wherever the donor organ was being notified, DCDs. Christmas Day, it was always at Coventry or around the country. The grafts were pretty poor. long warm ischemia time, and not surprisingly, not good function when transplanted. Blood banks, well, I won't say too much about them, unable, more often unwilling, to provide the blood that was needed for a transplant in those days. And I remember one weekend when I had to call on the household cavalry barracks and get a whole troop of soldiers down to King's, Denmark Hill, and we bled them in the side room of Todd Ward. Can you imagine any of that happening today? The anaesthetists weren't too helpful either. They were always going away and never too easy, never too keen on overtime working. And again, I had to hire in teams of anaesthetists when we had a donor organ and would otherwise have lost it. The two-site operation between Cambridge and King's worked surprisingly well. Roy could turn up at King's and operate and then go off and play squash, because we had the squash courts there. And we had fellows up at Cambridge when he was operating there that stayed for the first post-operative week. I don't think the King's fellows liked it much. They called it all sorts of things, notorious, infamous, ghastly, but they learned a hell of a lot and always refer to it now when I meet up with them. What probably wasn't realized is the fierce professional opposition to transplantation in the UK at the time. And I certainly experienced it, and I experienced it from Sheila Sherlock, who was convinced that it would never work. Transplantation should never be pursued. This is a quote from Tom Starzl's book, The Puzzle People, that he wrote later on the history of liver transplantation. By 1975, I quote it to you, only 2 liver transplant programs remained in the world from the rampage of the late 1960s, which had followed our first successes. Our centre and the combined Cambridge-King's series. How did we keep going? Why was it? What really enabled us to keep going? Because the results in those early 1970s were pretty poor. Fortunately, there were others in Europe coming in to give support. Henri Bismuth, who I was delighted to see here today, and Rudy Pickelmeyer at Hanover. And I always think of Rudy, what a mistake it is to have holidays, because, you know, he was really doing very well in liver transplantation and then took a holiday in Acapulco and went swimming in the morning and was never seen again. So don't take holidays if you're going to progress your life. But Pierre Clavierne made that very clear too. So what was it that kept us going? Well, it was the fact that we always had some patients who were doing extraordinarily well. And I just picked out 3 in this slide to give you some examples of what we were observing and what was fascinating to me as a medical hepatologist. On the left, I don't know if it's on the left or the right, there's George Knight talking to a newspaper reporter just 3 weeks after his transplant. And he was disabled in a wheelchair from chronic portal systemic encephalopathy after a portocable shunt. His EEG was ghastly, and yet within 2 to 3 weeks, with a functioning liver, all those changes were reversed. In the middle is a photo of Winnie Smith, transplanted like our first case for a massive primary hepatocellular carcinoma in an otherwise normal liver. She was the supervisor of domestic cleaners at Welland Garden Council City office. And she spoke at various conferences. She flew to San Francisco once to a transplant conference because she lived for four years, I think it was 4 years, 5 months before dying of a biliary tract septicemia. And this being a biliary tract meeting, as it were, I should refer to the difficulties that we had with the biliary tract anastomosis in those early days in getting the anastomosis to heal. Biliary fistula was, we thought, the Achilles heel of transplantation. The third patient over there is still alive. He was operated on in 1975. He had hepatitis B, chronic, again a hepatocellular carcinoma. His brother had died of HBV and HCV just 2 years before, but Gordon Bridewell had heard of the transplants being carried out in our program and wrote to me at King's and then came to see me. And at the time of surgery, we gave him anti-HBs immunoglobulin, and he's remained hepatitis B free and tumor free all these 48 years, and he celebrated his 70th birthday just 2 years ago. This slide shows you the evolution of liver transplantation in Europe. The numbers that were so small as we started in '68. And why did it increase? What happened? Results were poor overall, but it was the development of cyclosporin as a better immunosuppression in '78 that really kick-started it, because Tom Starzl reported 60% one-year survival with cyclosporin at the NIH conference in Washington that was held in '83. And I think it was those results, and I remember being there so well. I was talking on transplantation for acute liver failure at that time. And Rudy Schmidt, the chairman, wrote that the procedure merited much wider clinical use and was no longer a research procedure. But it was really only when tacrolimus was discovered in Japan in '89 that results really improved. And as they improved, the number of centers, as you can see in Europe, increased rapidly, as they did throughout the world. And on that slide is also shown much earlier on brain death criteria introduced, the UW solution, also very important in preservation, although we've moved much further on since then in terms of methods of preservation. I first heard of tacrolimus at the European Transplant Meeting in Barcelona in October 1989. Tom Starzl was waxing enthusiastically about its immunosuppressive potency. He didn't mention that it was a calcineurin inhibitor and had nephrotoxicity. We found out that later. But anyway, after hearing him, I got on a plane immediately and flew back to London, got hold of the British Council got hold of the Foreign Office got hold of the British Embassy in Moscow, because I had a patient in King's at the time with chronic rejection, and I was determined to get FK 506 tacrolimus for that patient. And I remember being in the front hall at King's, waiting anxiously for the courier to come from Heathrow with a supply of tacrolimus. Subsequently, we set up the European FK 506 multi-center randomized controlled trial in Europe. There was one also set up in America, comparing tacrolimus and cyclosporin. It was a very good carefully controlled trial, and it showed clearly the superiority of tacrolimus over cyclosporin in terms of much reduced chronic rejection and refractory acute rejection. And it was extraordinary that with this drug, one could sometimes see complete reversal of chronic rejection. Well, the liver, as you know, is a pretty odd organ immunologically. And although the highest potency of immunosuppression is needed for early graft acceptance, nevertheless, as the years go on with the graft, the amount of immunosuppression needed often becomes much less, and indeed may not be required at all, so-called operational tolerance. Tom Starzl, Pittsburgh, 1993, first described this in 6 non-compliant patients who stopped taking their immunosuppression some 3 to 13 years after transplantation. The following year, we started a planned withdrawal study. We'd already had it on, already been working on it in 18 patients who had survived more than 5 years after their liver graft. 28% of them, only though 5 cases, remained off immunosuppression at 3 years follow-up. And then in 2006, we looked again at those 5 patients, and only 2 of them had normal graft function, and 3 of them had had to restart immunosuppression. So operational tolerance, minimal immunosuppression, certainly is a feature of long-standing liver grafts, but it's not that common to be able to completely withdraw immunosuppression. And as some of you will know, there are many studies going on around the world trying to enhance this process by the use of Tregs and other immunological means. It would be churlish of me, I think, if I didn't, in this presentation, pay tribute to the extraordinary surgical skills that I was fortunate in my partner surgeon, Roy Kahn, and of course that Tom Starzl had shown and others were beginning to show in transplant programs around the world. This is a picture of the first triple transplant, heart, lungs, and liver, that we did in 1987 at Papworth Cardiac Center with Warwick and Roy and his team. What really was staggering was seeing the 3 organs removed, the chest and abdomen opened up, and this vast great hole that was there before the organs were put back. I shall never forget that. The patient was very interesting. She had a very rare complication of primary biliary cirrhosis long-standing, namely pulmonary hypertension, of which little was known. She'd gone into right heart failure, resistant to all treatment, and all we knew that it was related in some way to portopulmonary shunting. And she never again, after the transplant, experienced troubles with pulmonary hypertension. And in fact, she lived, I think it was 12 years in reasonable health, occasional attacks of bronchitis in the lungs. Transplantation for PBC became quite a fascination for me because of its recurrence in the graft. People didn't believe that diseases, liver diseases, could come back. And we published in 1982 in the New England the very first account of recurrent PBC in the graft. And I remember just how much that was opposed at the time by Tom. And I really felt this was one time when we really got ahead of him. He didn't believe it, said it didn't occur. Dimitri, his pathologist, agreed. And we had a whole onslaught of negatives from everywhere. But as you well know, PBC does recur. But it's interesting, it recurs only slowly and not very severely, and very rarely is an indication for repeat transplant. Very different, though, disease recurrence from PSC, sclerosing cholangitis, where patients have often end up by having several transplants. 1996 saw me being forcibly retired from King's on age grounds, and luckily there were other people who wanted me, and I went to University College London, building an Institute of Hepatology there. Interest in transplantation was only temporarily interrupted because in 1998, together with Nigel Heaton, we started the first living donor liver transplant program in the UK. And that is a picture of the very first case operated on, the mother with chronic HCV infection and her donor daughter. They did very well, and it was wonderful just this summer to see them return in follow-up, some 20 years on, both of them in excellent health. The reason for persevering with living donor transplantation is, of course, that private patients in the UK cannot get access to cadaver organs. We eventually published a series of 18 patients treated by living donor liver transplantation, with some interesting findings on differences in apparent rate of regeneration of the remnant liver and the donor organ. We also initiated a program of liver grafting for patients with disabling familial amyloid polyneuropathy, where there is a genetic mutation in their livers which leads to the amyloid disease, and which, of course, with a liver transplant is replaced. And we had some outstanding successes with that procedure. Over this time, I was also looking after George Best. And for any of you who are football fans, you will know that he was both legendary and one of the finest football players in the world. I didn't know much about football. I never liked it. But, and I remember him coming into my consulting room at the Cromwell Hospital with his wife, who was exceptionally attractive. And I couldn't take my eyes off her. Anyway, George developed alcoholic hepatitis, acute alcoholic hepatitis, liver decompensation. And there was much publicity, obviously, about him having a transplant. Nigel and I insisted that he should have a 12-month period of abstinence before going ahead. In other words, double the 6-month rule. And he did well, and he remained abstinent for 2-3 years after the transplant, only relapsing when his marriage broke up. And it was always sad. I didn't do very well out of all the publicity, but I will never, ever regret having given him the chance, because he was an exceptional person. And I shall never forget either talking at the memorial service which the government held for him in Stormont in Belfast, the government buildings, which was packed, and people lining all the streets of Belfast around, mourning his passing. Truly a remarkable person. Though away from King's, I still worked with King's when I was at UCL, and this slide, and I'm coming to the end of this presentation, was on acute liver failure, which became a major interest of mine over the years in terms of liver support devices. And the King's criteria, which we published at Grady and others, gave a strong positive predictive value for the need for a transplant. And those King's criteria were adopted throughout the world. So positive prediction was okay, but the negative predictive value was not so good, which meant the patients not fulfilling criteria nevertheless could deteriorate, and by that time missed the chance of a donor organ. In 2014, we published, Will Burnell and I and others published, a new dynamic model for paracetamol overdose, which was based on various criteria and in addition brought in sequential measurements over the first 2 days, which were more valuable in terms of the final outcome. So this brings me to my last slide and to my return to King's, which was quite extraordinary in that one day I received a call from the chairman of King's College Hospital Foundation Trust, who said, "Roger, will you come in one morning and we could have a talk about things?" And I went along thinking he was after money. That's what I thought, because I had a foundation, and I thought he was wanting some money to do something or other at King's. But he said, "Roger, we want you to come back." So I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we want you to raise up King's a bit more from where it's gone since you left." So I went back and I built this building, which you can see here, the third institute that I've had to build. And we've continued work. We went in there in June 2016, and we now have some 30 scientists working there in collaboration with the clinical service at King's and also wider collaborations around the world. And I put just two areas of work that relevant to transplantation that we're much involved with at the bottom of the slide. The first, intestinal dysbiosis and the gut bacterial translocation in cirrhosis, which underlies the development of multi-organ failure, susceptibility to infection, and you know just how important the gut microbiome is becoming in disease pathogenesis. And we published with Jasper Jazz in Virginia the restoration of normality in the gut in cirrhotic patients following a liver transplant procedure. The second big area relates to the use of checkpoint inhibitors in the immunotherapy for HCC, which represent a major step forward, and we're the central laboratory for the big multi-center trial of nivolumab. So, Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of this saga, 50 years personal experience I've touched on in transplantation. And all one really can conclude, and many have concluded the same, is that liver transplantation does represent the most extraordinary and only major advance that can transform the lives of those dying of end-stage liver disease. It is truly a gift of life. Thank you.